dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology. Hello, I'm Rob.
I'm Matthew.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists. TEFL News.
Okay, so for today's TEFL News, I'd like to talk about the recent ELTons that took place.
Okay.
Is that how you pronounce them? I've never.
Apparently so, yeah.
Elton or Elton?
Well, I thought
I
it was
said Elton.
ELTons.
Oh, okay.
But it's not, it's ELTons. I checked.
I would never have thought it was ELTons.
Well, that's one variation.
ELTons.
The ELTons, they took place Thursday, June the 4th.
Yeah.
So at the time we're recording, that was yesterday, but by the time this goes out, that won't be yesterday.
Yeah, it'll be a week yesterday.
It'll be next week.
Yeah. Last week.
But they took place yesterday, and they were hosted in London at the British Medical Association.
Okay.
And do you know much about the ELTons? Are you familiar with?
Yeah, I've heard about them. They kind of...
Not a lot. Someone on Twitter said we should be nominated for them, but we won't. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and we were too humble to suggest that.
We'll readdress
that nomination.
We'll readdress that at the end, perhaps. But so it's a British Council award ceremony, sponsored by Cambridge English, and the claim is that these are the only international awards that recognise and celebrate innovation in ELT.
Okay.
That's a big claim.
It's a big claim, but who am I to challenge it?
Yeah.
And it's been running since 2003, so it's fairly established, I guess.
Fairly.
So applications are accepted online in the previous year. I believe around November is the deadline.
Okay.
And there's a number of judges that receive the nominations, and they then decide who goes into the shortlist.
Okay.
I think in March the nominees are announced.
Yeah.
Okay.
And apparently the process that they choose the final nominees are decided by something called the Delphi technique. Are you familiar with the Delphi technique?
It sounds like one of those fashionable 70s methods, doesn't it? The Delphi technique.
It's not a method related to English teaching. It has other applications, but basically it's an impartial way of reaching a consensus.
Right.
So when the final nominees are announced, the judges themselves don't actually know who's going to win, basically, in the end.
Okay.
Right.
It's like a blind vote? Or...
It's kind of, yeah. It goes through a process of email communication. In this case, email communication. And the judges themselves don't know who finally will win. But they've all obviously nominated
Right.
themselves. And there's about 6 or 7 judges around the world, I imagine. I'm not sure who exactly. Maybe we shouldn't...
Could be us.
Could be us, yeah.
Could be us.
Could be one of us.
But it's not. Or is it? Anyway, so so
it's not, by the way.
So they make very clear in their information about this event that the judges don't even know who they're nominating.
Right.
And I think
they go on about this quite a lot, don't they? I think the judges know.
Well, I was wondering why they make such a kind of song and dance about it. I think it's because it is heavily sponsored.
Yeah, it's probably. I think it is.
There's a lot of vested interest and that sort of thing.
Right.
So like any other award ceremony, for example the Oscars or the BAFTAs, they have a red carpet.
Yeah.
Which I was watching earlier today.
Oh wow.
And well, they had a presenter. I believe his name was James. I'm not sure who he is exactly, but he was basically interviewing people as they walked in, and there were the likes of Alan Maley came through, and the new IA TEFL president. And there are other people that were obviously the nominees.
Did James know who all these people were? Was he shouting?
He seemed to know who they were. Yeah. It was a little bit awkward because I think he was trying to do it in the style of an Oscar red carpet. He wasn't asking what they're wearing and stuff, obviously, but he was kind of asking, "What are you doing here? What you here? Are you here to collect an award?"
Did he say, "What are you doing here?"
That kind of thing. So it was quite interesting to see that kind of thing for an ELT award ceremony. I found that a bit odd, to be honest. I'm not quite sure why they were doing that. We're not the only people to express that sentiment. But anyway, that was a live stream. It was on the internet, and it's still available online.
Yeah.
Okay, and so like I say, people were promoting their products, their books. And there were writers coming through and kind of selling
Oh, really?
selling their products.
You're walking down the red carpet with a copy of their book.
Not really, but they might as well have been. To be honest. Yeah.
A T-shirt with the cover on.
Yeah. And the event itself was hosted by Angela Rippon, OBE.
Okay.
Yep.
The
national treasure.
A national treasure, a British BBC News journalist. And she was a good presenter, actually. It was very good.
She's a pro.
She is, yeah.
She's had experience.
She did really well. She gave an interesting opening speech. There were a couple of points in there that I'd like to talk about. So she talked about her brief experience with teaching English in a Kenyan slum.
Right.
Oh.
She said that she'd had a chance to teach, and she went into it. She said she went from a TV show, unrelated to English teaching, and she decided to go into a classroom and teach. And she said, "I can speak the English language. I should be able to teach it." And there seemed to be a few gasps in the audience because I mean it's commonly accepted that is not your only qualification as a teacher.
People shrieking, falling out of chairs, that kind of thing.
Travesty, outcry. So anyway, she went in and she recalled some of the things that took place in the class, and it seemed she got a lot of people, the students in the class, to kind of introduce themselves and say what they want to do with their lives.
My name is Angela Rippon, Neil said.
She didn't do that. Yeah.
I work for the BBC.
But she was kind of talking about her teaching approach. So she got people to write little introductions, then she just went around and kind of corrected and gave them new words to better say what they wanted to say, and that kind of thing. So she was kind of dealing with like vocab kind of in the moment, and writing
point
them
of
down.
need.
Point of need. So I thought that was quite interesting that she's had no experience in teaching, but yet she's sort of gravitated towards that kind of teaching.
Yeah.
It's quite
Are you
interesting.
saying she invented dog men?
I believe I am. Yeah. And she kind of said that for the students, it seems that English is the key to freedom in Kenya.
All right.
So she kind of recalled
adopting a role as the imperialist.
Right, yeah, again, that's another, So she was talking about how the importance of English teaching, basically. So that was her way of kind of...
It's the kind of thing you have to say at an award ceremony. It's like when they talk about the importance of actors and Hollywood and stuff.
Right.
And she also I can't remember exactly, but she also talked about the importance of correct pronunciation. It was a little bit hackneyed and archaic. And
How was her pronunciation?
Well, it was very good, and obviously she speaks... That's not my...
She's Swedish?
Yeah. She speaks like a news presenter. Journalist.
But I mean, the BBC made a decision quite a while ago now, not to only have RP presenters.
Right, yeah.
She's one of the old.
And she was reduced to presenting the ELTons from then on.
So that's what she's doing these
Kicked
days.
out by some Welsh speaker.
Anyway, so obviously with any award show, there are of course winners.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about some...
And losers.
And losers too. Let's talk about the winners today, though. First of all, Professor Henry Widdowson.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show.
Yeah.
Is he a friend of the show?
He's been on the show.
He's been on the show.
He's aware of the show.
Yeah. Won a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Well
Well,
deserved.
I was just going to say that.
And he gave a long, not a very long speech, but he gave a very interesting speech at the end, recalling what are his achievements and why has he won this award. So he kind of recollected on why he feels that he was given the award in the first place. And
Did he say that thing that people often do when they receive lifetime achievements?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why I'm getting this. I'm not dead yet.
Basically, yeah. And he thanked everybody else, obviously, and but he kind of talked about the way that he kind of not fell into it, but he was given a role as a British Council officer. And he kind of was like, I had really no idea what I was doing at the time, kind of thing. So he was talking about some of the ignorance that kind of helped him along the way,
Right.
in a sense as well. But I think what he said is he feels that he's brought professionalism to the industry, which he acknowledged of himself, which is quite interesting.
Professionalism and like respectability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
But luckily there's a whole army of backpackers just working to take that away again.
Other winners included, there was a award for the MA Masters.
Okay.
Every year, British Council nominates an MA Master dissertation from a collection of British universities.
Do they have to read all of the MA Master's dissertations? Because
Not all
I
of
wouldn't
them.
want to have that job.
Yeah.
They put forward, I think, 18 or 20 from a certain group of universities. Our friend was nominated for one, which we'll talk about later.
Okay.
And the winning one was working with CEFR can-do statements.
Okay.
That was the winner this year by Tim Goodyear.
Okay. Congratulations, Tim.
Congratulations, Tim. So we look forward to reading that. And apparently that will be available on the British Council website to read.
Nice.
Okay. Nice.
Other winners include a new Writers Award for Chris Lima for EAP Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's another winner. A Course Innovation Award for Oxford Discover.
Okay.
Which is an inquiry-based textbook for young learners.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets them thinking, kind of, I guess, critically at a very young age about the world. Yep. Which seems quite interesting. I was looking at some of the images and it seems quite interesting. Mm-hmm. And finally, there are others, but we'll just talk about Innovation in Learner Resources. Again, Oxford Learner's Dictionary of Academic English.
Okay.
That won the Innovation for Learner Resources.
I wonder what was so innovative about it.
I wonder.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'd just like to talk about is... So I guess I'd just like to open up discussion, really. What do you think the real purpose behind these sort of awards are?
Well, first of all, apparently it's the only one of its kind.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If it's, I mean, you said at the beginning that the point is to celebrate innovation.
Yes.
In which case, spreading new ideas within the industry to people who wouldn't maybe normally be exposed to them might be one purpose.
Sure.
Obviously, that doesn't have to be done with a big ceremony and everything.
No.
Yeah.
But everybody likes going to a big ceremony.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of wonder who this is relevant for. Like, for your average teacher, do they really care? I mean, like, the schools are going to be buying the books and choosing the courses.
And the books will get promoted around the world.
Exactly,
So there are ramifications of this award.
So, I mean, I guess, in a sense, the awards legitimise a certain series of books or whatever over other books, something like that. But I don't know how relevant it is for people just going about their day-to-day business of teaching.
It seemed like it was an industry awards rather than a teacher-based awards.
Yeah,
because
I'm sure it is.
I would have, when I first found out about the ELTons, I was hoping for kind of success stories from individual teachers in kind of very localised settings. I thought that would make for a better award ceremony.
Yeah, I remember
just
a long time ago, it must have been one of the first or second times they did it, there was this language school in London that won some kind of ELTon for... They had a program where they took their students out to different parts of London and just had specially tailored lessons depending on where they were. Right. And that won an award. Mm-hmm. But I mean, all the things that you mentioned seem to be about, well, except the master's dissertation, but a lot of them are just about other popular course books by popular publishers.
They were using the word product a lot. Mm-hmm. They weren't shying away from that word.
Were they using the word customer instead of student? Because that's a warning sign.
I don't know, to be honest, But anyway, so as I say, the ELTons took place recently, and you can find out about the ELTons by going onto the British Council website. I think the live stream is still up.
Okay, the live stream.
Hope it's not
still live. It was live at some point.
There's an empty hall.
It's called the live stream on the website. It's still live. It's still live. Okay. So that's what they call it. But anyway, that's still up there. And that was today's TEFL news.
TEFL Pioneers.
Today's TEFL pioneer is Thomas Prendergast. Continuing in my series of TEFL pioneers with impressive names. Yep. Thomas Prendergast.
Right,
have you heard of him?
I've heard the name,
Nope.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. For once, someone's heard of him. So Thomas Prendergast was born in 1806, died in 1886, which means he died at the age of...
79 or 80.
Yes, depending on when his birthday was and his death day.
Not just the one.
Do you know that?
No, unfortunately.
Okay. It would have been nice if he made it to 80, to be honest.
Yeah, it would.
Have a big party.
It would, but he had some other things to console him. In particular, he was the inventor of the mastery method of language learning.
Okay.
He's seen as a forerunner to people who are a lot more famous than him. For example, Harold Palmer, who we talked about in episode 11, Otto Jesperson, people like that. Not episode 11, sorry, episode 2. And he's kind of neglected. He's not paid so much attention as those guys. He doesn't have books written about him particularly. He started his career working for the East India Company, and he was kind of like a writer for them. And while he was working for them, he picked up Tamil and Telugu. Is that how you say that language? Telugu.
Sure.
Yeah. So he worked for the East India Company, and he learned these languages. So he was a language learner first. And he retired in 1859 from his position, and then he returned to England and went blind.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
That is featured quite prominently in all of his autobiographies. He went blind at that point.
Autobiographies.
Sorry.
How many did you write?
Sorry, his biographies. But after that, he started to write. So he started to write after losing his sight, and he formulated the mastery method of foreign language teaching. He started writing about English, but later he moved on to talk about different languages, and he wrote a series of books for teaching French and German and Spanish using the mastery method. Yeah. So the mastery method was inspired by Prendergast's study of how children learn languages, and because of this, he came to three conclusions, which his method was built on top of.
Sorry, do you mean first languages?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay.
So the first of his conclusions, the first of his establishing points, was the failure of grammar translation methods. This was in the mid to late 1800s, and he said that the scholar fails in spite of the advantages he possesses in having access to the accumulated learning and the combined experience and skill of all of Christendom, and yet every one of his children, unless subjected to counteracting influences, accomplishes this task without books, without study, and without instruction. And later on he also said that men study grammar and learn thereby to interpret the written language when their object is to acquire the habit of speaking it. They are always engaged in decomposing instead of composing.
Right. Okay.
And so he argued that the learner must emancipate himself once and for all from the odious habit of literal translation.
I like that. That's a good quote.
Yeah. He was one of the more flowery of the ELT writers. So what do you think of that first establishing point of the mastery method?
I think it's a focus on speak. That's a common thing with a lot of our pioneers so far. Is a recognition that learning how to speak the language should be the main thing.
Yeah.
My understanding of the grammar translation method is that the main purpose of it was to be able to translate.
Yes. Yeah.
And in that case, it was probably somewhat successful. But obviously, if people were trying to apply that to learning how to speak, then I think it's nice of him to point out that that's probably not going to work.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, it's a well-articulated point. That's what I like to say.
Okay.
Odious.
So that was the first of his points, the failure of grammar translation. The second point was the need for memorization. Again, a quote from him: "The power of speaking other tongues idiomatically is attained principally by efforts of the memory, not by logical reasoning." So he thought that you didn't learn to speak a language by learning all the different bits of the language and then sort of piece things together, but you learned through mimicry and memorization of like whole sentences. It's kind of chunking, I guess, in a sense. Yeah. And so he thought that language should be presented through practical sentence models and a limited set of about 200 essential words to begin with.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, how does that sound?
Practical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
You're stepping on my toes slightly with I'll be talking about a similar topic later.
Okay.
But yeah, that sounds interesting.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, reasonable within reason.
Okay. And the final point was that he believed that language is an aggregate of sentences, which I mean, it sounds silly, but at the same time, it's quite an interesting point, I think. Language, it's not just words and rules and that kind of thing, but it's made of sentences, and sentences built on sentences.
Just looking at the discourse level.
Yeah, and also just slight changes on sentences.
Yeah.
So he said,
I'm just going to say that it's another kind of feature of a lot of our pioneers, is this recognition that you have to look at language at the discourse level.
Yes, yeah. It kind of makes you think that perhaps all of these ideas were floating around for a long time. They just weren't communicating with each other about them.
Or they were, and there were other reasons that other methods came off.
So Prendergast said, language is a tree which is propagated not by seeds, but by cuttings, not by words, but by sentences. That's what he said. Again, nice turn of phrase. And that sentences would eventually give birth to new sentences. So you learn one sentence, you make slight changes, and it becomes a new sentence. You make slight changes, it becomes a new sentence, and so on. So you learn by memorization and making slight changes to things. And so these three foundational principles led him to the mastery method. So in the mastery method, language is learned by imitation, by repetition, by mimicry, and by memorization. Or
Yeah, that's why I've heard that. Yeah.
So using typical sentences as base material, you would then give the students vocabulary and guide them through changing the sentences very slightly. Quite similar to the approach that Guan came up with, where you kind of ring changes on the base sentences. Vocabulary was introduced in a very structured way to facilitate the creation of new sentences. And this is an interesting point. He discarded grammar almost completely, claiming that usage is the law. Like Judge Dredd.
Yeah. What does that mean? Usage is the law.
Because it's he. I think what he meant by that was that it's about basically what you say. So if you have a sentence, the grammar isn't important. It's the sentence itself that's important. Obviously, the sentence is composed of grammar, but you don't need to think about the grammar. You just need to know this sentence accomplishes this task. You use this sentence to do this thing. You don't need to know the grammar underlying that. You don't need to know the tenses and all that kind of thing. I think that's what he was getting at.
So it was more like meaning, function.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. But how does that sound? You seem skeptical with your skeptical face.
I guess. I mean, again, this is something we're going to talk about in my section. But that kind of disregard for what I assume he's terming grammar. I think if students are still, or if learners, or if any user of the language is tasked with conveying meaning of a certain thing.
Yeah,
they're trying to convey meaning of a certain thing. Knowing whether or not they're talking about the past or the present, those kind of things are going to affect their choices in that sentence.
Right.
So deciding, okay, I'm going to have this whole sentence which is going to refer to this specific thing in the past, and then I'll learn a whole new sentence.
Yeah.
If I'm referring to the same thing but in the present, you don't need to learn a whole new sentence.
Right.
You just need to switch out that one part of the sentence.
Maybe that was what you meant by ringing changes, perhaps.
Okay.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
Right. But then that's grammar.
Yes. Yeah.
So he seems to be prioritising meaning, and maybe the grammar comes from negotiation amongst learners. Maybe he thinks the teaching of it, you don't need to do. They'll work it out.
Well, possibly. I mean,
at the time, maybe that might have been quite groundbreaking.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of what he was saying was quite groundbreaking in the context of the time in which he lived, and I think perhaps one of the most groundbreaking things that he said was that fluency was the only way of measuring progress in language learning. So not grammatical correctness, not having a wide vocabulary, none of that. Fluency. That was what he believed was.
How did you define fluency?
As fluency. He defined it as the only way of measuring language learning.
It'd be interesting to see how he measured it.
Yeah.
I think he meant ability to communicate and speak quickly. Essentially, communicate quickly with people, get your meaning across.
But it's still, I mean, even today, it still hasn't been sort of fixed, has it? Fluency, as we found out at that talk last week.
Which talk was that?
A couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, Scott Thornbury's talk about fluency.
Right. It's still not really fixed. So I mean, it'd be interesting to see what his definition was at the time.
Yeah. But yeah, that was the mastery method. I think for the time it was quite a radical idea. It must have been very popular because it ran into different editions across different languages and that kind of thing. Okay. But he kind of fell out of the history books a little bit. I mean, obviously he shows up here and there in papers and that kind of thing. But I think it's high time that he were recognised for his contributions.
Why do you think he's fallen from grace?
Why?
He never won an ELTon?
Yeah.
They didn't have those in 1886.
I think it's probably because he was overshadowed by people who came a little bit later on.
Right.
And by the more showy people like what's his name? Berlitz.
Right.
Yeah. I think that those people who were living at the same time and doing language work at the same time, they were more theatrical with how they presented their ideas, and I think that's probably why they got the recognition that Thomas Prendergast didn't. Yeah. So that's our TEFL pioneer for this week, Thomas Prendergast. TEFL cultures.
So this episode's culture is the lexical approach.
Okay.
Which I was surprised to find we hadn't covered before. For some reason I thought we had.
Yeah. Well, it's because you don't listen to the podcasts after we record.
That's probably why.
Don't say that.
So are you guys familiar with the lexical approach?
A little bit.
A little bit?
In Yes.
When I say the lexical approach, what do you think of?
Words.
Words and lots of them. Vocabulary.
Yeah.
Mainly vocabulary.
Yes, in a way. And it's interesting when you're talking about Prendergast. A lot of it almost sounded like a proto-lexical approachist.
A proto-Indo-European.
Yeah. A lot of what he said sounded like it kind of maps onto the lexical approach.
Yeah.
A quick little bit of background, I guess, before... So the lexical approach came into being through Michael Lewis's 1993 book called The Lexical Approach.
Yeah.
But this came after a kind of renewed interest in lexis,
Right.
which probably came about through the communicative approach.
Mm-hmm.
And just a recognition that I think maybe before that, especially through other methods, grammar was kind of seen as the main way to look at the language.
Right.
Divide the language up into grammar forms.
Yeah.
And just learn the grammar, and then the lexis is just there to kind of plug into those sentences, the grammar.
Right.
So if you look at the present perfect, you don't really need to think too much about, where you've been, just that form, the present perfect.
Right.
Anyway, what also pushed us along was the development of corpuses, and the recognition that, things like high frequency words, and then especially this idea of chunks, like you talked about,
Yeah.
concordances, how lots of words just like to hang out with other words,
Right.
and recognizing this, the Willises, David and Jane Willis, put together a course based on the co-built corpus,
Right.
An actual syllabus, a lexical syllabus. And at the time, it was hailed as it was going to be the next big thing in language teaching.
Did it win an ELTon?
It didn't. No. What's the Razzie version of an ELTon, whatever that is.
An ELToff?
An ELToff. Thank you. It didn't go anywhere, basically.
Right.
It was more or less ignored. I'm not sure why, but anyway. But soon after that, and I think as far as I can tell, their lexical syllabus, it was a focus on lexis, but it didn't ignore grammar altogether. But Lewis's book, called The Lexical Approach, took the view basically that, actually he said a few times it's not a lexical syllabus that he's promoting, because his main aim seems to be to blur the distinction between lexis and grammar.
Right.
So one of his famous quotes about his approach is that, or his beliefs about language, is that language is not lexicalized grammar, it's grammaticalized lexis.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
And then especially this idea of chunks, you get into gray areas. And I think now a lot of people recognize that ways of describing language, or ways of dividing up language, it's just on a spectrum. You
Right.
have kind of individual words at one end, and you have a grammar rule at the other end, and then you have kind of gray, you get into a big gray area in the middle.
Right.
Things like I think colligations and like phrasal verbs and multi-word verbs, those kind of things.
Yeah.
You can't really decide if it's an example of
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So his main point was that, his first main point is you don't have to teach grammar, similar to Prendergast.
Prendergast. Yeah.
And that all learners really need to do, I say all, they have to, and again, similar to Prendergast, is a focus on memory.
Right.
They have to just get very familiar with the high frequency chunks, and then even the low frequency chunks eventually.
Right.
Can you see any issues with his approach so far?
I think I don't know. I feel if you just learn loads of chunks, then I can imagine getting stuck a lot, basically.
Right.
Like when I speak Japanese, for example, I do have certain chunks that I can use, and then I'll get to a situation where I need to change it. I need to innovate in some way, and I don't know how to do it because I don't have the chunks that will do that.
Right.
Yeah. So I can see that being an issue.
Maybe a conflict between routine and rules, and not overly applying something, basically.
Over applying rules, you mean?
Or routine, you learn these chunks and you over apply them, and or
So one criticism, like you said, that's been put is this idea of fossilization.
Yeah,
Right.
It seems to be a higher risk. with a lexical approach. The other big criticism that it's had is that he's never really explained what a lexical approach looks like in the classroom.
Right.
He puts a big he's kind of seems to be inspired or influenced by Krashen. So he's a big believer in lots and lots of comprehensible input.
Right.
And seems to even say that just learners need to, if they read a lot and take in enough examples of these chunks, if they come across them enough times, that's enough. And then that they can, through these chunks, they can, I guess the idea is like subconsciously get grammar patterns from those chunks. Because these chunks are not just things like, collocations like brush your teeth or commit a crime.
Yeah.
It is things like have you ever, and those kind of forms, which hold some kind of grammar in them.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I mean, I guess the important point is noticing, maybe not making up, but kind of finding out, discovering the uses yourself. It seems like a lot of this, even today, extensive reading at your level, perhaps feeds into this lexical approach. A lot of other things seem to feed into this.
Right.
Maybe that's
yeah. And I think that the main criticism of it has been that he seems to think that this is the only thing that students need.
Right.
I think a lot of people recognize that a lot of these things, noticing chunks and working with collocations and all this stuff, is a fairly standard part of a lot of courses now.
Yep.
But at the same time, what most people also promote is the idea of noticing patterns and for want of a better term, grammar rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of the problem that I have with the whole Krashen, comprehensible input thing, is that like even if you get loads of comprehensible input, you're not necessarily going to pick things up. I pick things up in a very scattershot way.
Yeah.
If I watch Japanese TV, for an hour a day a week, I'm only going to pick up like 3 phrases, which is not.
And then if you don't use them in the next few weeks,
you'll
lose them probably.
They go away.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably the same for this kind of thing. And also, I'm suspicious of anyone who says you only need to do this to learn the language. Like,
right.
know that it's not that simple.
Yeah, of course.
People often talk like the dogme is very much situated in the lexical approach.
I'm not sure about that. I think there are. I think, for example, like a lexical syllabus or something that acknowledges. So it's combining the memorization of these chunks with a kind of internalization of some kind of awareness of patterns, and that both are needed. And it seems like where Lewis is most vulnerable to attack is his focus just on memorization of these chunks. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's come out of his work. Even grammar structures, which are kind of snuck in with like things. So a famous example is that sentence said "Have you ever?"
Yeah.
And I guess in a lexical approach, you would never say, "Okay, this is have as an auxiliary verb," and then you can add a past participle on.
Yeah.
But you learn "Have you ever?" And then plus the corpus data apparently says that following "Have you ever?" Been, seen, had, heard, tried. Those 5 verbs make up more than half of all occurrences of have you ever.
Right.
So I think that might be something useful. If they learn those 5 sentence heads, they're expressing a lot, or they're capable of expressing a lot.
I was actually going to say it's interesting because in Japanese, I had the same experience of asking someone, how do I say this? And it was, have you ever seen something? And they told me the phrase. And for ages, that was all I could say.
Yeah.
And then I heard someone say the same thing with a different verb that I just learned.
Yeah,
and then suddenly I was like, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
That's the grammar bit, and that's the word bit.
Right.
And it makes sense now. Yeah.
And and I think that does happen. You're a language teacher and you're aware of language.
Yes.
So we're maybe better primed to notice
At
those
the
kind
time,
of
I was
things.
only barely a language teacher.
Right. Okay.
In our interview with Professor Anna Cianova, she talks about the importance of multi-word expressions and maybe the teaching of it, but also how, in terms of the cognitive load on the brain, we kind of read things holistically in bigger chunks. And she kind of says that a lot of language is not as original as it seems. Which suggests we don't need to go back to the beginning to teach all of this again. It's
well, that's another maybe basis of of the lexical approach, which is that this idea that little of what we say is really novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Basically, we're kind of repeating stuff that we've heard before.
It's definitely true on this podcast.
To an extent, yeah.
To an extent.
Yeah, to an extent. Or when somebody says, this so-and-so's won a Lifetime Achievement Award, the natural response is well-deserved.
Yeah.
Right.
But at the same time, obviously, you do form I don't think you can just memorize enough chunks to apply to a certain situation. You need to play with them, etc. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, that's this week's culture, the lexical approach.
So thank you very much for joining us once again.
And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at teflology@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is @teflology, and please leave a review for us on iTunes. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so thank you. Keep it going.
Oh, God. Do you want me to do it?
No, we'll do it. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us once again. Let's do that again. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah. You do the first bit.
I'll do the whole thing.
Thank you very much for joining us once again. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us once again.
And if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can email us at teflology@gmail, and we're also on... No? Is that not right?
gmail.com.
gmail.com.
What's your problem with the
don't know.
.com?